Sister stole my daughter's savings for a special edition book, blew it on sushi, refused to give it back, tried to gaslight us, and threw a fit when I forced her to return it, so I finally kicked her out. I've always believed in teaching my daughter Lily the value of hard work and patience. She's 13, at that perfect age where she's learning to balance independence with responsibility, and one of her biggest passions is reading. Not just casual once-in-a-while reading, no, she's the kind of kid who gets lost in stories for hours, who sniffs the pages of new books before even cracking them open, who can debate the merits of different fantasy series like a seasoned scholar. So when she discovered that her all-time favorite novel was being released as a special edition, leather-bound, gold-foiled edges, complete with exclusive illustrations and the author's notes, she was determined to get her hands on it. It wasn't cheap, but she didn't even hesitate. Instead of begging me for money, she squared her shoulders and decided to earn it herself. I was so proud of her. She made a whole plan, mapping out exactly how much she needed and what she had to do to reach her goal. Every spare dollar went into a glass jar she kept on her desk, right next to her little reading nook. She did extra chores around the house, scrubbing the baseboards without being asked, folding laundry before I even got to it, and even voluntarily unloading the dishwasher, which was usually the most despised chore in the house. She also started skipping snacks at school, opting to bring homemade treats instead of spending her allowance at the vending machine. Our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, even hired her to babysit her 4-year-old son, Max, a tiny ball of chaos who could probably give professional stunt doubles a run for their money. Lily would come home exhausted but triumphant, clutching a few crumpled bills like they were her ticket to victory. Day by day the jar filled up. She'd drop in coins and bills with the most satisfied little smile, watching her hard work turn into something tangible. She even started making a game out of it, counting and recounting her savings like a little dragon hoarding treasure. And then one evening, she came to me with tears in her eyes. Her jar was empty. At first, I thought maybe she'd miscounted or misplaced the money. Maybe she had taken some out and forgotten about it. But the moment I saw her face, red, blotchy, that trembling lower lip she gets when she's trying not to cry, I knew this wasn't just a simple mistake. "The money's gone," she choked out, voice shaking. "All of it." I felt my stomach drop. I walked into her room and saw the jar sitting on her desk, completely empty. Not a single bill. Not even a stray penny left behind. The worst part? The jar was still in its usual spot, untouched except for the fact that it had been completely cleaned out. Someone had taken it. I took a deep breath, trying to think rationally. "Are you sure? Maybe it fell behind the desk." "I checked everywhere," she said, shaking her head. "It was there this morning. I counted it. I was so close, I only needed $10 more. And now it's just gone." I went into full investigation mode. I checked under the desk, in the drawers, even inside her backpack in case she'd moved it and forgotten. But deep down I already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. Someone had taken Lily's money. And in our house there were only so many suspects. Lily and I lived alone, just the two of us, but my sister Tessa had been staying with us for the past month while she got back on her feet. She was going through one of her usual rough patches, job hopping, couch surfing, making vague promises about turning things around. I had let her stay in our guest room, despite my better judgment. She had a habit of borrowing things without asking, and her definition of borrowing rarely included returning. But stealing from my daughter? That was a new low even for her. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she had taken the money for an emergency. Maybe there was some logical explanation. But as soon as I confronted her, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. I found Tessa in the living room, sprawled across the couch with her phone in one hand and a half-empty bag of chips in the other. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Tessa," I said, keeping my voice even, "did you take Lily's money?" She scoffed, still scrolling. "What?"
No.
I folded my arms. "It's gone. She's been saving for months, and now the jar is empty. You're the only other person in the house." That got her attention. She rolled her eyes and sat up, setting the chip bag aside. "Wow, so I'm automatically guilty? Real nice, sis." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my temper in check. "I'm just asking a simple question." "And I already answered," she shot back, her tone turning defensive. "I didn't touch it." I stared at her, taking in the details. The way she avoided eye contact. The way she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. The way her knee started bouncing like it always did when she was lying. Then I noticed something on the coffee table. A brand new takeout bag from her favorite sushi place. The expensive one across town. The one she definitely couldn't afford, considering she didn't even have a job. I felt my blood start to boil. Tessa, I said, voice dangerously calm. Where did you get the money for sushi? Her mouth opened and closed, like she was scrambling for an excuse. I had some cash left over from last week. I shook my head. No, you didn't. You borrowed money from me for groceries 3 days ago. Because you were broke until you found work. Remember? Her face twisted in frustration. Oh my God, you're seriously accusing me of stealing from my niece? Yes, I am, I said bluntly. Because that's exactly what happened. She stood up, arms flailing dramatically. You always assume the worst about me. Maybe the money just disappeared. Ever think of that? I let out a bitter laugh. Oh sure. Maybe a burglar broke in, ignored all the electronics, and just really wanted a 13-year-old's savings. Tessa huffed, grabbed her phone, and stormed toward the hallway. This is ridiculous. I don't have to listen to this. But before she could escape, Lily's small, shaky voice cut through the room. Aunt Tessa, she said, standing in the doorway. Please just give it back. Tessa froze. For the first time she looked guilty, but not guilty enough. Instead of owning up to it, she muttered something under her breath, and disappeared into her room, slamming the door behind her. I turned to Lily, whose eyes were glossy with unshed tears. I knelt down and hugged her tightly. I'll get it back, baby. I promise. And I meant it. I wasn't about to let my sister get away with this. I let Tessa stew in her room for a while. I knew her. If I pushed too hard too soon, she'd just double down and dig her heels in, making herself the victim. No, I had to play this smart. Meanwhile, Lily sat curled up on the couch, hugging one of the throw pillows, her face a mixture of sadness and frustration. She's not going to give it back, is she? She asked quietly. She will, I said, keeping my voice firm. One way or another. Lily sniffled but nodded. I could tell she wanted to believe me, even if she wasn't entirely convinced. An hour passed. Then 2. I waited until I heard the creak of Tessa's door opening, and the shuffle of her feet, heading toward the kitchen. That was my moment. I walked in to find her pouring herself a glass of orange juice, acting as if nothing had happened. Tessa, I said, leaning against the counter. I'm going to give you one more chance to do the right thing. Give Lily her money back. She let out an exasperated groan. I told you I didn't take it. I folded my arms. Then let me see your wallet. Her head snapped up. Excuse me? You heard me, I said, unfazed. If you didn't take it, then you won't mind proving it. Her fingers tightened around the glass. That's an invasion of privacy. I raised an eyebrow. You're living under my roof, eating my food, using my electricity, and oh yes, stealing from my daughter. I think I have a right to ask. For a second she just stood there, glaring at me. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she slammed the juice down on the counter, and yanked her wallet out of her hoodie pocket. Fine. Here. She flipped it open, making a big show of pulling out a few crumpled bills and some loose change. See? Not exactly rolling in cash. I narrowed my eyes. That wasn't nearly enough to pay for the sushi, and she knew it. Tessa, I said, voice low, where's the rest? I don't have any more, she snapped. I tilted my head, watching her carefully. Then I guess I'll just have to check your room. Her eyes widened. You can't do that. I shrugged. I can actually. Unless you want me to call the cops and report the theft. Her whole body stiffened. She knew I wasn't bluffing. I wouldn't actually have her arrested, but she didn't know that for sure. Finally, she let out a defeated groan and threw her hands up. Ah, fine. Fine. She stomped past me toward her room, and I followed close behind. She yanked open her dresser drawer and pulled out a wad of cash, shoving it into my hand without looking at me. There, she muttered. Happy now. I counted the money. It was almost the exact amount Lily had saved, minus maybe $10, which I assumed had gone to her sushi feast. I clenched my jaw. Unbelievable. Tessa crossed her arms, glaring at the floor. It's not like I was stealing it. I was just borrowing. I was going to put it back. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh really? When? After Lily's book sold out. She rolled her eyes. You're being so dramatic. No, Tessa, I said, my voice sharp. Dramatic is stealing from a child. Dramatic is playing the victim instead of taking responsibility. She muttered something under her breath, but I was done listening. I turned and walked back into the living room, where Lily was waiting, hopeful but cautious. When I handed her the money, her whole face lit up. You got it back? I got it back, I confirmed. She threw her arms around me, squeezing tight. Thank you, Mom. I kissed the top of her head. No one messes with you, baby. Not even family. And as I stood there, hugging my daughter, I made a silent decision. Tessa's time in my house was officially running out. Tessa sulked for the rest of the night. She barely spoke to me, refused to make eye contact, and made a big show of slamming doors like a moody teenager. But I didn't care. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. Lily, on the other hand, was practically glowing. As soon as she had her money back, she sat at the kitchen table, recounting it carefully, smoothing out every bill like it was sacred. Then, with the biggest grin, she pulled out her phone and placed the order for her book. It should be here next week, she said, bouncing in her seat. I smiled, watching her. The relief on her face, the excitement in her voice. It made every ounce of stress from dealing with Tessa worth it. My daughter had worked hard for that money, and no one was going to take that away from her. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. I sighed, already knowing who it was. Come in, Tessa. She peeked in, arms crossed, eyes flickering with something that almost looked like regret. Almost. I'm leaving tomorrow, she said flatly. I didn't react. Okay. That threw her off. She blinked. That's it? No begging me to stay. No, oh Tessa, where will you go? I let out a dry chuckle. You think I'd beg you to stay after what you did? She shifted uncomfortably, rolling her eyes. I said I was going to pay it back. I shook my head. That's not the point, and you know it. You stole from my kid, Tessa. You lied. You gaslit me when I called you out. And now you want me to feel bad that you're leaving. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. Look, I messed up, okay? I needed the money. And I thought I'd fix it before anyone noticed. It was stupid. I get it. I stared at her, waiting for the apology I knew would never come. But it didn't matter. I'd already made my decision. I love you, Tessa, I said, my voice softer now. You're my sister. But I can't keep bailing you out. You need to figure things out on your own. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. That told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't mad that I was kicking her out. She was mad that she couldn't manipulate me into letting her stay. Fine, she muttered. I'll be gone by noon. I nodded. I hope you figure things out, Tess. I really do. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. And for the first time in years, I felt lighter. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of cabinets opening and closing. For a split second, I thought maybe Tessa was trying to steal something else before she left. But when I walked into the kitchen, I found her making a cup of coffee, her suitcase by the door. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. Lily was still asleep, which was probably for the best. I didn't want her to deal with any last-minute drama. Tessa had already done enough damage. After a few sips of her coffee, she finally sighed and glanced at me. I know you probably think I'm the worst person in the world. I shook my head. No, I don't. But I do think you need to take a hard look at yourself, Tessa. You're not just hurting yourself anymore. You're hurting the people who love you. She didn't respond, just stared into her mug like it held all the answers. Then, without another word, she grabbed her suitcase, walked to the door and left. No dramatic goodbyes. No last-ditch efforts to guilt me into letting her stay. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind her. I exhaled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. Later that afternoon, Lily came running into the kitchen with her phone in hand. Mom, look, my book just shipped. Her eyes were bright, her whole face glowing with excitement. It was the happiest I'd seen her in days. I pulled her into a hug. I'm so proud of you, baby. You worked hard for it. She grinned. Yeah, and you worked hard to get it back. I chuckled. No one messes with my kid. When the book finally arrived a few days later, Lily unwrapped it like it was a priceless treasure. She held it in her hands, ran her fingers over the gold-foiled edges, and then, just as I expected, brought it up to her nose and took a deep sniff. I laughed. Does it smell like victory? She nodded solemnly. It smells like justice. And with that, she curled up in her reading nook, lost in the world she had fought so hard to own. As for Tessa, I didn't hear from her for a while. A few months later, I got a half-hearted apology text, something vague about not being in a good place back then. I didn't respond. Maybe one day she'll change. Maybe she won't. But either way, I knew one thing for sure. My daughter had learned that standing up for herself mattered. And I had learned that sometimes the hardest thing you can do for someone you love is let them go. Next story. Grandparents hated my boyfriend, tried to guilt me into leaving him, threatened to cut me off, and told me I'd regret it, but when I chose myself, they had to decide if losing me was worth being right. I had always believed that love was supposed to be simple. You meet someone, you fall in love, and you figure things out together. But as I sat at my grandparents' dinner table, pushing food around my plate while they listed out every reason why my boyfriend wasn't good enough for me, I realized just how wrong I was. I grew up with my grandparents. They weren't just family. They were my whole world. My parents had passed away when I was little, and from that moment on, my grandparents took over raising me. They were strict, but they loved me fiercely, and I never doubted that. They had plans for me, plans they had been making since the day they took me in. And those plans did not include me dating someone like Alex. Alex was kind, hardworking, and honest. He made me laugh, made me feel safe, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a future I actually wanted. But to my grandparents, he was nothing more than a distraction. He wasn't from a good family. He didn't have the right kind of job. He didn't share our traditions. It didn't matter how happy he made me. He simply wasn't enough for them. You'll regret this, my grandmother warned me that night, shaking her head as if I was throwing my entire future away. We only want what's best for you. I knew they thought they were protecting me, but what they didn't understand was that I wasn't a child anymore. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I could keep choosing their version of what's best over what actually made me happy. I thought that after that dinner, things would settle down, that maybe with time they'd come to see Alex the way I did. But I underestimated just how deeply their disapproval ran. It started with the small things, passive-aggressive comments, pointed sighs, and the way they changed the subject whenever I mentioned his name. My grandmother suddenly needed my help more than ever. Every time I planned to see Alex, she conveniently wasn't feeling well, or needed me at home. My grandfather, normally a man of few words, made it clear in his own way. He'd leave newspapers open on the kitchen table, with headlines about struggling young couples, divorce rates, or articles about the importance of marrying within one's own kind. It was subtle, but the message was loud and clear. I was making a mistake. First, I tried to ignore it. I told myself they'd come around. But when ignoring didn't work, I tried reasoning with them. I reminded them that they had always taught me to value kindness, honesty, and hard work. 3 things Alex had in abundance. But they would just shake their heads, as if I was too young, too blind to see the future disaster I was walking into. The worst part? They refused to even meet him. He's just a phase, my grandmother muttered one evening, barely looking up from her knitting. You'll move on, and you'll thank us for keeping you from ruining your life. Ruin my life. That's how they saw it. As if being with Alex was a mistake, something shameful. And no matter how much I loved them, no matter how much I owed them, I couldn't ignore the quiet rage that built inside me every time they spoke about him like that. I felt trapped between 2 worlds, the one I had always known, the safe, familiar love of my grandparents, and the one I wanted, a future with Alex. I kept waiting for the moment when they'd soften, when they'd see that my happiness mattered more than their expectations. But as the days passed, I started to wonder if that moment would ever come. As weeks passed, the silent war between my grandparents and me only grew heavier. I could feel it in the way my grandmother sighed whenever she passed me in the kitchen, in the way my grandfather suddenly had an opinion about everything I did, where I went, what I wore, how late I stayed out. Alex noticed the change in me. I wasn't as lighthearted as before. and I struggled to talk about what was happening at home. It wasn't that I was ashamed, but how do you tell someone that the people who raised you, the people who gave you everything, refuse to accept the person you love? How do you say that without breaking their heart? One evening, as we sat in his car outside my house, he finally said what I had been dreading. "I feel like I'm pulling you away from them," he admitted. His voice was calm, but I knew him well enough to hear the pain underneath. "I don't want to be the reason you lose them." I turned to him, feeling a sharp pang of fear. "You're not. This isn't your fault. But they think it is." He gave me a sad smile, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. "I don't want you to have to choose." Neither did I. But deep down I knew that was exactly where this was heading. I wanted to believe I could have both, a relationship with Alex and the love and approval of my grandparents. I told myself that if we just held on long enough, they would eventually come around. But how long was I supposed to wait? And what if they never did? As I stepped out of his car and walked up to my house, I realized something. No matter what I did, someone I loved was going to be hurt. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could live with the choice I'd have to make. The tension in my house had reached a point where even the smallest interactions felt like landmines. Every conversation with my grandparents was laced with unspoken disappointment, every glance from them a quiet reminder of their disapproval. It was exhausting. Then one evening everything came to a head. I had just come home from seeing Alex when I found my grandmother sitting in the living room, waiting for me. My grandfather was in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the television but clearly not watching it. The air was thick with something unspoken, and I just knew, that something was about to happen. "We need to talk," my grandmother said, her voice calm but heavy. I sat down, bracing myself. She exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "We've given you time to come to your senses. But you haven't." I swallowed hard. "Because there's nothing to come to my senses about." She flinched just slightly before shaking her head. "You're young. You think love is enough. But it isn't." My grandfather finally spoke. "You're throwing away everything we've worked for." His voice was rough, tired. "Everything we sacrificed to raise you, to give you a good life. And for what? Some boy." I felt my hands clench into fists. "He's not just some boy. He's the person I love." "And love isn't enough," my grandmother repeated, her voice sharper now. "You think you know better than us? You don't. One day, you'll see that we were right." I stood up, my heart pounding. "And what if you're wrong?" The words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge. My grandmother's eyes darkened, but it was my grandfather who delivered the final blow. "If you keep seeing him," he said, voice low and firm, "then don't expect us to stand by and watch." For a second I couldn't breathe. "Are you saying you'll cut me off?" My grandmother looked away, but my grandfather didn't flinch. "I'm saying we won't be a part of this mistake." A cold weight settled in my chest. I had always feared this moment, but I never truly believed it would happen. That they would choose their pride, their expectations over me, over my happiness. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had a choice to make. And no matter which path I took, I was about to lose something. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying my grandparents' words over and over in my mind. "We won't be a part of this mistake." A mistake. That's what they saw when they looked at Alex. Not the way he made me laugh when I was having the worst day. Not the way he held my hand like I was something precious. Not the way he made me feel safe in a world that had taken so much from me. They saw a mistake. I had always believed that my grandparents' love was unconditional. They had raised me, given me everything, and for that I was endlessly grateful. But now I had to ask myself a painful question. Was their love truly unconditional, or did it come with terms and conditions? I thought about walking away from Alex, about making things easier for everyone. If I broke things off, my life would return to normal. My grandparents would be happy again. The tension would fade. But then what? I would spend my life proving to them that I could be the granddaughter they wanted me to be, living by their rules, making the right choices. And maybe, just maybe, I would earn back their approval. And yet, the thought of walking away from Alex physically hurt. Could I really give up the one person who saw me, truly saw me, for who I was? Could I live with myself knowing that I had chosen to break my own heart just to keep the peace? No, I couldn't. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't one I made lightly. But I refused to let someone else dictate what my happiness should look like. So the next morning I packed a bag. Just a small one, enough for a few days. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I knew I needed space. I needed to show my grandparents that I wasn't just some child they could control. When I stepped into the kitchen, my grandmother was at the stove making breakfast, and my grandfather was reading the paper like nothing had happened the night before. "I'm leaving for a few days," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My grandmother turned, her expression carefully blank. "Where?" I met her gaze. "Alex's place." For the first time in my life I saw real fear in her eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. But I did. Because if I didn't stand up for myself now, I never would. I grabbed my bag, took one last look at the only home I had ever known, and walked out the door. And for the first time in a long time I breathed. The moment I stepped outside, a strange mix of fear and relief settled in my chest. I had done it. I had finally chosen me. But now the reality of that choice hit me. I had no idea what came next. Alex opened the door before I even had the chance to knock. He took one look at my bag, at my face, and he just knew. Without a word, he pulled me into his arms. "I'm sorry," I whispered into his shoulder, even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. He held me tighter. "You don't have to be." I stayed with him for a few days trying to process everything. I expected my phone to blow up with calls from my grandparents, but silence stretched between us like an ocean. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't sure if they were waiting for me to come crawling back or if they had already made their decision. I had chosen Alex, and to them that meant I had chosen wrong. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty. It was the grief. Because that's what it was, grief. I was mourning the version of my life I had always known. The unconditional love I had always believed in. And even though I had made my choice, I still wanted them to choose me back. But days passed and they didn't. One evening, as I sat on Alex's couch, my phone finally buzzed. I held my breath as I read the message from my grandmother. "Come home. We need to talk." I stared at the words for a long time, unsure if I was ready to face them. "Are you going?" Alex asked gently. I nodded. "I have to." When I stepped into my grandparents' house, everything felt the same but different. My grandmother stood by the kitchen counter, her hands gripping a dish towel like it was the only thing keeping her steady. My grandfather was at the table, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. They didn't look angry, just tired. "We don't agree with this," my grandfather said finally, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We probably never will." I swallowed hard. "I know. But," my grandmother continued, looking at me with watery eyes, "we love you more than we love being right." The weight I had been carrying for weeks cracked just a little. "We don't understand your choice," she admitted, shaking her head. "But we don't want to lose you because of it." Tears blurred my vision as I stepped forward, wrapping my arms around her. She held on like she was afraid I'd slip away. "I just want you to be happy," she whispered. I pulled back, wiping my eyes. "I am." And for the first time I really meant it. Things weren't magically fixed that night. My grandparents didn't suddenly welcome Alex with open arms. But they were willing to try, willing to be in my life even if they didn't fully understand my choices. And that was enough. Because love, real love, isn't about control. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. And this time they chose me back.